There was a time in history where it was okay to cry inside, but you would never cry out loud. Lily Isaacs is the matriarch of the Grammy-nominated and multi-award-winning bluegrass country Christian music group, the Isaacs. She started her journey not as a Christian, but as a young Jewish girl living in the Bronx. The horror of her parents' ordeals surviving the Holocaust and the Nazi murders of her other family members led her to her personal relationship with Jesus. This is her story. This is today's Nashville. This is Faith. Lily, it is such a pleasure to sit down with you again. It's so nice to see you. Thank you for inviting me into your home.
Thank you, Terry.
Your story just is amazing. I met you several years ago and you shared your parents' story, your journey with the Isaacs, and I thought, oh, I want you on my show. Let's go back and where it all started.
Well, I guess it all started when I was born for me. My mother and father are Polish. They were both from the same hometown called Częstochowa, Poland. They didn't know each other at the time, but after a series of events, which we'll talk about, they did meet each other and got married. They wound up in Germany after the war, and they got married there, and that's where I was born, in Munich, Germany.
Oh,
yes.
Okay.
So that's how my life started. My parents stayed there a couple of years, and we migrated to America when I was 2 years old via Ellis Island. And when I was 9, we all became American citizens again at Ellis Island, and I grew up in the Bronx, New York.
So tell me a little bit about your parents and what happened before that.
World War II started in September of 1939. My parents were from large families. My mother had 4 siblings and her parents, and my father had 5 siblings and his parents at home. And my father would always say that when the war broke out, there was some rumor around, but of course in those days you didn't have internet, and very rarely did you have a radio. So people really didn't know what was going on, but there's rumors of war going around. So my father said that all of a sudden, one day out of nowhere, these big trucks came barreling, army trucks, Nazi trucks came barreling into the little town of Częstochowa where they live. And he said that the soldiers would get out on the streets and get on these megaphones, and they'd order everybody on the street out of their homes, come out of the street. And if you didn't, they would go from house to house and just make everybody come out on the street. They had no clue why, but that's what they did. They didn't know if it was going to be a bomb or they needed to evacuate for whatever reason. But that's when they started, the Nazis started separating families. So my father and his brother were taken away from his parents and his other siblings. My mother also with her sister came out, and her mom never saw her mom again, or her brother or sister. So everything was chaotic. And they sent one person to this place, one person to that place. So they were transported. Of course, they didn't know each other at the time, just happened to be from the same hometown. But my father was transported to a Częstochowa ghetto, and my mother was at the Warsaw ghetto with her sister. And then eventually they wound up in concentration camps. My father was in Buchenwald in Germany, and my mother was in Bergen-Belsen in Germany, 2 years.
How old were they?
My mother was 19, my father was 25.
Did they even know what was really happening at that time?
They had no idea. They had no. I wondered in my mind so many times if 6 million Jews were killed, plus others. If you knew you were going to be killed in your family, would you not fight back? They didn't know. They didn't know where they were going. And then they were on starvation diets, a crust of bread a day with a glass of water. That's all they got. So people were weakened and they get sick. And they had no idea. But they survived a nightmare. I heard a lot of stories from my mother, especially. She'd tell us a lot of the things that she and her sister survived and how they got through it. But in 1945, when the war was over, they were liberated by American soldiers and our allies. And all of my life, my mother would say, when those American soldiers busted through those gates, she said they looked like angels from heaven. And we have a great respect for our military here because they freed my parents. So that was our humble beginnings.
So how did they meet then?
After the war was over, there were so many people that were emaciated. They were skin and bone. A lot of them were sick. So they started these places called displaced persons camps. And organizations like the Red Cross, United Jewish Appeal, B'nai B'rith came together across the world. And they went into Germany and into Poland, and they started these camps where they would have proper health care, nurse them back to health with food and whatever. And my parents met in one of those displaced persons camps in Feldafing, Germany, which is outskirts of Munich. That's where they met. And I think they just had a lot in common because they were from the same hometown. And they got married there. And after they got married, they stayed 2 years. I was born there. And I have pictures of me when I was a little girl with my mother in Feldafing, Germany. But also, again, in those days, you had to have a sponsor that would send for you to come to migrate to a different country. My mother's brother was in America, and he sent for my father and my mother and I to come to New York. So we got on a ship. I don't remember it. Of course, I was only 2. I heard a lot of stories about how my mother was so seasick that my dad would have to hold me the whole time. But we landed via Ellis Island to the Hudson River and wound up in the Bronx. My uncle taught my father how to be a bread baker, which was his trade. And we started a new life here. That's how it all began.
And you wrote this book, You Don't Cry Out Loud.
Yes, I did.
Tell me about the title.
I wanted to write a book for many, many years, and I just kept putting it off because there was so much deep pain. My mother passed away in 2014, and I was already writing the book while she was in the assisted living. But one of the comments my mom would tell us was, you know, my girls would say, "Grandma, how did you stand it? How could you do it?" And she'd say, "Oh, you cry, but you don't cry out loud." And that stuck in my brain. I said, that has to be the title of my book.
What would happen if you cried out loud?
You'd get attention and you'd probably be killed or beaten up or something. So yeah, she said they had to keep it to themselves.
I read this book, it's powerful.
Thank you.
Now, when you came to the Bronx, you were just a toddler.
Yes.
And tell me about your life there and you growing up.
Well, I grew up in it. We had an apartment. Actually, I had 2 or 3 different apartments. The first one I don't remember. I was too young. It was kind of living in with another family to get adjusted to the culture here, I guess. And then we lived in a small apartment on the 2nd floor, and it was just me and my parents. And then when I was 5, my mother had my brother. So it was just the 4 of us, and we did the best we could. My parents didn't speak English, so they had to go to night school to learn how to speak English to become an American citizen. And they studied for that test. My father was a bread baker. He'd go to work every night and came home, slept through the day, and Mom would take care of us. Then I started school. It was just regular life in New York City. We lived on the 1st floor, and the fire escape was all enclosed. So I was 4 years old, and my mother wasn't going to let me out on the streets, so she laid a blanket out on the fire escape, and I played with my dolls. And then one day I heard these kids playing, and I just looked through the bars to see who it was, and my head got stuck in between those bars, and she couldn't get my head out. She tried grease and butter. We had to call the fire department for them to pry that open. So anyway, that was my youth.
And then God had an amazing plan for your life. You got into music, the Isaacs.
Yes, ma'am.
And we're going to talk about that when we come back.